Welcome back to Real Faith Conversations, and in this show we try to talk about life, culture, and faith in the most genuine way possible. My name is Ryan Morris, and I am here with Samantha Kelley, who is the founder and current president of Fierce Athlete, Inc. She played Division I soccer at UConn and is currently involved in competitive rowing. She has spent the last 12 years working for Catholic nonprofits and outreaching to female athletes. She graduated with a master's in Catholic psychology, holds her certification in strength and conditioning, and has extensively studied the theology of the body. It is actually through the teachings of theology of the body and the Catholic Church that she discovered what it means to be both feminine and athletic. These teachings have the power to heal, and through Fierce Athlete, she desires to share those truths with female athletes and women across the world. Today, on this show, she is going to be talking about these things and also diving a little bit into the Transgender Forum held at St. Peter. Without further ado, welcome, Sam.
Thanks. Happy to be here.
Yeah, it's amazing that we were able to get you on the show because you're really busy all the time with Fierce Athlete and all the other things you're doing, but I'm so glad you're able to make time for us here.
Yeah, no, of course. I'm glad it worked out.
Great. So for the audience that may not know you that well, I know a lot of people already know you through the retreats, especially the women at our parish, but can you just explain your backstory a little bit?
Yeah, so let's see. I grew up in Connecticut in a great Catholic family, and we were all pretty athletic. Yeah, it was a big athlete family, so ended up taking a liking to soccer, and it was always a dream of mine to play Division I soccer, and so a lot of my childhood was really oriented towards that goal. What I did on the weekends, what I was eating, how much I was sleeping, how hard I was training, was really oriented towards that. And faith was an important part of our family life, but I think at the time I viewed it as something that made me a good person. Mm-hmm. It was just kind of an aside. But going into college, again, going in to play D1, I blew out my knee pretty bad. Oof. So I tore my ACL, LCL, and meniscus. And they told me I'd never play D1 again.
Wow.
Yeah, so that was a pretty soul-crushing diagnosis, but I'm pretty stubborn. And so ended up going to UConn and using their doctors so they could really follow my rehab. And it was 3 surgeries in 13 months before I stepped foot on a soccer field. So my freshman year of college, right, I'm going to UConn to play soccer, and I'm sitting the bench because I'm hurt. I had to have another surgery that fall. And it just was kind of embarrassed, because here I am trying to fit into a new culture, a top 25 program, and I come in hurt, and that led to a really significant identity crisis, right? And I mean, we all struggle with this, right?
Yeah.
What do we base our identity off of? Oftentimes it's what we do. Mm-hmm. And so I was an athlete, and suddenly I was sitting the bench, and, it was really 3 years before I was able to play at that D1 level again. And in that time, I was just empty and miserable, and tried to fill that void I was feeling with a lot of different things, a lot of different team pressures, a lot of different partying, a lot of different even some quote unquote good things like being a perfect student, mm-hmm. double major and taking too many classes and all that. Right. But, at the time my sister had started playing college soccer and she started getting involved with a Christian athlete group. And she just reached out to me and said, you know what, like, why don't you try something like this? Cause I think she knew I was struggling. And so I, kind of started looking around and got involved with the group myself. But then preseason of my junior year, I went to Mass during preseason to escape preseason. It was pure excuse, right? At that point, I'd kind of been going to Mass, kind of not when it wasn't convenient. And, we're on campus in early August doing 2 days plus film, plus rehab, plus conditioning. And you're just around your team all the time. And I just wanted a break. And so my coaches let me go to Mass. And
wow.
God uses small windows, small doors, and
that's truth. Yeah.
It was so Focus, which is the Fellowship of Catholic University Students, is an organization where they put campus missionaries, former students, onto campuses to outreach. Mm-hmm. And we had Jesuits at UConn, and I had even tried meeting with them at one point, and was just a little perturbed by some of the responses I was getting. Seemed kind of wishy-washy when I was actually seeking some truth. And that day I went to Mass during preseason was Focus's first day on campus ever. So again, just God moving mountains for me. And I was the only student there because it was early August. And so I was a target for them, and got introduced to the missionaries, and ended up, long story short, joining a Bible study and getting invited to a conference that winter that I kind of went to against my will, if you will. I was kind of punked into going. And I went to a much needed confession, just an honest confession. There was a priest that came with us who was a huge athlete himself. And so I really felt like I could relate to him.
Yeah.
And he started to, for the first time, really explaining how faith and sport coincided. And so I just felt like I could be vulnerable with him. And so I went to a confession with him. And then I had it's hard to describe, but a radical encounter with Christ in adoration, to the point where it was like everything changed. Because I just knew that I was loved as the Lord's. I was loved as his daughter. I wasn't loved because I was a Division I soccer player, or I came back from a career-ending injury, or I was a good student, or whatever. I just was loved for who I was. Mm-hmm. And that changed everything. That sent me on a trajectory, which I'm sure we'll talk about, but where I was committed to living my life for him.
It's amazing. Oh my gosh, such a great story, especially like a lot of young people, they put their whole faith into like something like a sport or something, like their whole identity in that. And when it's taken away, you're like, what am I now? And it was cool how the Lord was working in that moment in that time on the campus to say, hey, you know what? Your identity is in me, not in this sport. It may be great, but I'm what matters most. That's awesome. And actually, we had 2 Focus missionaries on the show, Mary Kate at Pitt, and then Bobby Ruark. He's actually another Focus missionary that is around this parish.
Cool.
So, and a lot of our parishioners love Focus and support them, which is great. So they helped encourage you a little bit.
Yeah.
In those times.
They did. No, they do great work. I actually went on to then become a Focus missionary for 5 years.
Oh my gosh. Yeah. So now you're the third. You're the third on this show. I didn't know that.
I'm a retired Focus missionary. No, yeah, I served for 5 years.
Oh my gosh.
So I was at the University of Texas working with their student athletes for 3. And then I was a regional director for 2, which is what brought me to Philadelphia. And
wow, small world.
I know, right?
Crazy.
Yep.
Yeah. So that's amazing. Anytime we can share these stories of, what could be arguably like a slump in your life where you're like, I'm hurt now. What am I going to do? I wanted to play D1 my whole life, and now I have the opportunity and it's taken from me. What do? Turn to Christ. Right. Mm-hmm. And it's that cool story of just inspirational, honestly. And now it's leading you to these things that you're doing, now, which is amazing. So you mentioned that it kind of like kickstarted your trajectory into ministry and what you're doing. Can you explain how that transition happened?
Yeah. I mean, I think it's almost like when, I had that encounter with Christ in the Eucharist, I began to see the world a lot more clearly. I saw the world through eyes of love, right? Through the love that I'd experienced. And so when I looked around at, the athlete culture that I was immersed in, which is definitely the play hard, party hard culture, because of all the pressures that athletes face. And there's so many more today. Student athletes are known to party more, drink more. Yeah. It's just kind of a crazy, you wouldn't think, right? You'd think that we would take care of ourselves, but it's just kind of this crazy culture. So I looked around at my teammates, and, I was really the only practicing Catholic or Christian on my team out of 30 girls. And I just saw the need. I wanted the girls, the women around me, my teammates, my sisters, I wanted them to know the love that I knew. And so that became my mission, was to share that with them in small ways. Some it was I knew they were Catholic or Christian, so it was inviting them to Mass. It was starting a team Bible study. It was inviting them to pray before games. By my 5th year, when I was a captain and actually came back and started and was playing, I had 12 girls praying with me before games.
Wow.
But for a whole other group of girls, that was just, I wanted them to know that I loved them. For some of them, that was picking them up at 3 a.m. I'd drop them at a party and I would go pray for them in adoration, and then I'd go pick them up
Oh my gosh.
because I was so convicted that just to pray for their souls, that I was on that team at that specific time for a reason.
Yeah.
And I think that's something for our listeners to realize, well, why am I where I am right now? And I realized, through stepping off the field one day in frustration, the Lord just kind of hit me over the head, and he just said, this isn't about you. And that convicted me that I was on that team at that particular time to reach those women. And if I left, who was going to do it?
Yeah.
And that really drove me. And so, I was looking at law school or working on Wall Street. And, the Lord just put on my heart being a missionary. I saw how that woman that changed my life, that kind of initially I met and I joined her Bible study, she gave 2 years and she radically changed my life. And so I said, you know what? I'll give 2 years, right? Why not? Turned into 5. But
Oh my gosh.
yeah, so
That's awesome.
That was a trajectory there, and that was great time, great formation. I worked amongst, national champion level athletes at the University of Texas, and then oversaw 8 campuses for 2 years. But I would say my second reversion, really the second moment in my life where I felt like just this, I don't know, ability to see clearer, I guess, was when I encountered the theology of the body.
So I wanted to dive into that a little bit.
Yeah. So my 5th year as a missionary, my spiritual director was like, I want you to go on this TOB course. The Theology of the Body Institute, for those of you who don't know, is local. It's in this area, and they host week-long courses. And so I begrudgingly went. Usually it's like a theme in my life when I don't want to do something and somebody suggests I do it. It's probably a good thing. So I went to a week-long TOB course, and I had been, reaching out to athletes at this point for 7 years. And, when you're dealing with issues, body image, sexual confusion, not feeling feminine, it's important to introduce these people first and foremost to Christ and their true identity. But when you don't have that other piece of like, well, what does it mean to be human? There's just a lack there. And so when I discovered TOB, like, oh my gosh, this is the anecdote. This is the anecdote for our times. I truly believe that. We can go into that. But that encounter with that teaching made me kind of look around and say, okay, nobody out there is talking about this in the realm of athletics.
Mm-hmm.
And admittedly, they will admit this. A lot of the Christian Catholic organizations out there are very male dominant. And I found that the issues that women were dealing with specifically were very different from men.
Yeah.
And so through a matter of prayer, the Lord called me to start my own nonprofit, which is Fierce Athlete. And then while I was forming that, I worked for the TOB Institute for 2 years and just got to sit in on every course and get deeply formed so that when I went full time with Fierce after it was up and running, I had that formation to kind of move forward.
That's amazing. And kind of backing up a little bit because you did a good job articulating how you were feeling during those times. What would your advice be for women or anybody going through something similar to what you faced and kind of battling that and maybe wrestling with their spirituality, who they are as a person, their identity, things like that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, and we've heard this, like my deepest identity is a daughter of God or a son of God.
Mm-hmm.
We hear that,
Mm-hmm.
but the reality of it, if it really hits our hearts, it changes everything, right?
Yeah.
It's like any way that I struggle or sin or I don't know, get upset, like any of that is all, it's all a lack of that realization that I'm just loved as his daughter. And what that means is I could sit in this chair the rest of my life, or I could go on to cure cancer and God would still love me the same.
Yeah.
Like his love for me isn't dependent upon what I do
Mm-hmm.
or what I look like or others' opinions of me. Those are the kind of the 3 categories that I talk about, because those are the things that are really vying for our attention, whether it's what you do, you're an athlete, or what you look like, right? What, you feel like you need to, how you need to pose on social media or what you need to wear, and then others' opinions, right? Whether that's your coach or your parent or your siblings or your friends or the social media world, right? We base our worth off of all of those things. And at the end of the day, they matter to a certain extent, but what ultimately matters is what the Lord thinks. And his response to us is always one of love. And that then creates the freedom once you know you're just loved, that creates the freedom to really fly.
Yeah.
And that's what we start with in Fierce. Like that is the fundamental truth that we have to all start with.
Yeah. Yeah. And being an athlete, it's very competitive. It's very goal oriented. You want to achieve. And sometimes when you fall short of that expectation, it's demoralizing. It's your whole being is just taken. And I think that's a good start. What you just mentioned is knowing that you're loved regardless of the outcome. You don't have to earn it. And I think a lot of times when you're looking to be starting on a team, you have to earn it from the coach's eyes. And so that is a hard barrier to overcome, because you're like, I need to do good for my coach, or in God's standpoint, I need to prove something to God, right? And that's just not the same, and getting over that is something huge,
Yeah. Yeah, it's hard. I mean, and in one sense, I think athletes have a propensity for the spiritual life because they're used to, that internal meditation, that visualization, right? That discipline. In order to get better, they have to train every day. Well, in order to get to know the Lord, you got to spend time with him every day.
That's true. Yeah.
However, at some point you have to break that, productivity mentality, because prayer isn't about doing, it's about receiving. It's about being. I mean, yes, you can do certain prayers, but at the end of the day, like, it's about being and receiving. That's the posture we take before the Lord. And so it's kind of a lesson we have to learn. And that's, I mean, what I'm constantly trying to learn too. And not, anything I do in life needs to come from a fruitful prayer life. Not just this, well, I can do this, I can do this mission, I can white knuckle it. Yeah, I have a drive and I have a large capacity, I can. And sometimes I do rely on myself, and I do. But at the end of the day, I need to be first.
Yeah, that is so true. And then kind of tying in theology of the body to Fierce. How do you kind of bridge the two worlds in your program, in your nonprofit?
Yeah, what I love about TOB is, people think, first of all, there's a lot of misunderstanding surrounding it. It's just for married couples. Not true. Or, this is some new teaching. I mean, it's new in the sense that John Paul II brought light to it, but this is the church. This is what we've always believed about the body and about sexuality, and about masculinity and femininity. And so it's it's particularly important given our current state of confusion in the world. But where I start is, no matter what sport you play, the one thing that's constant is the use of the body. The body is the art form.
That is true. Yeah.
Right. And when we think about the human person, oftentimes as Catholics, we only concentrate on the spiritual. We think our body's just a corrupt shell that when we die, it's going to get buried and we're going to be relieved of it finally. Well, that's actually heresy. The body is good. It's created good. And actually our bodies will be resurrected in the second coming. And so they're important. And what it means to be a human being is that we're a body-soul composite, meaning we're united. The soul is the form of the body, and the body is the form of the soul. So on a very basic level, as Catholics, we need to focus on the spiritual, but we also need to focus on the physical, which I think is a gap. Now, on the other end, athletes, you focus on the physical, but you're not focusing on the spiritual, because one affects the other. If you want to be the best athlete you can be, I would argue, then you need to be the most physically fit. You need to be the most mentally tough, but you also have to have a spiritual depth, because it is affecting the other components of the body.
Wow.
So that's like the most basic principle. But with women specifically, there's a ton of body shame out there. There's a lot of eating disorders within athletics. So the more that we can challenge women on their body dysphoria and challenge them to view their bodies as good and as beautiful and as designed by the Lord as such, the better handle they're going to have on some of those issues. In regards to, what type of, life they're living, right? It's what you do to your body. So if you're partying on the weekends, is going to affect your spiritual life. There is a lot of promiscuity and sexual confusion and homosexuality in women's sports. There's a whole ton of reasons for that. But when we look at TOB, it talks about the complementarities of the genders. God created us male and female to be complementary to one another.
Yeah.
Men are not better, women are not better. They're equal but different.
Mm-hmm.
And that is something very contrary to our culture, but also in women's sport. Historically, when we look at the feminist movement and in the context of sport, sport historically was male dominant. And when women entered the scene, they tried to not only be men, but be better than men.
Mm.
And there are very natural differences in the male body and the female body, right?
Yeah.
And that reveals the difference in masculinity and femininity. So I use the example of basketball. So if you look at how men play basketball, naturally it's very different from women.
Mm-hmm.
Even though people will argue all day long that gender is neutral, right? Or whatever they want to argue. If you look at the games, they're different. And the height of masculinity revealed through the male body, which is external in the sexual act, is sacrifice. And so when we look at the game of basketball, men are naturally a little bit more athletic. They're naturally driving to the hoop. There's a little bit more of sacrifice involved.
Mm-hmm.
Now, if you look at the women's game, it's more team oriented. There's a lot more passing.
Mm.
The height of receptivity, as a woman in the sexual act, I receive and then I bear forth life. So the height of femininity is receptivity and then bearing forth life. So I have a natural receptivity to my teammates, more so than men. So I'm going to pass the ball more. So it's
wow.
really,
that's an interesting insight.
It's really beautiful because I always believed this lie I wasn't feminine because I'm 6 feet tall and I'm athletic and I love sports. Well, that's a lie. Because we are a body-soul union, the fact that I was created a woman makes me feminine in my whole being.
Yeah.
The fact that you were created a man makes you masculine in your whole being.
Yeah.
Now I can reject that, but just in who I am feminine, and I can live that out through sport. So that's how we kind of weave in TOB.
That's great. And that's a good segue into the next topic because you were invited to be part of the Transgender Forum here at St. Peter. We actually held it earlier in the year.
Yep.
I think March at some point.
Somewhere around then, yeah.
We're having it again, and you're back as a panelist for the forum. And so dive into sort of, because you were talking about masculinity, femininity, and people can reject that kind of thing. And I think that's the root of what this forum is about, right? Just having conversations around that whole dysphoria around gender, right? Can you talk a little about the forum a little bit?
Yeah, so it's called Clarity in a Confused World. It's happening here at St. Peter's October 15th. I think it's from 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. or so. There's going to be 8 speakers, so it's going to be a pretty full day.
Including you.
Including me, and I am also emceeing and running the Q&A sessions. So I will
busy
be
day for you.
Very busy, yeah. But it's such an honor. You know, it's a little bit outside my realm within Fierce Athlete. However, I also am leading these women's retreats, as you guys all know. And, you know, I never thought, we did a middle school one last winter. And I never thought I would stand in front of a group of girls and say to them, your body is not wrong. And I just stared at them. And I said it again. I said, your body is not wrong. God did not make a mistake. Because what's happening is I think the transgender diagnosis, quote unquote, is up, I think it's 4,000 or 5,000% in the last couple of years. And what we're seeing is, I mean, we live in a time that is very confusing. Surrounding, you know, are there 2 genders? Yes. But genders, you know, pronouns, and you can be born one way but choose something else, you know, and this is happening from young ages. I mean, Washington State, in kindergarten, they have to state their preferred pronoun and name, you know, and it's hidden from the parents. And oftentimes you see the parents encouraging it. It's kind of a weird thing.
And I know in some toddler programs too, they're doing that.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so it's like, you know, I asked myself, you know, growing up, I was a tomboy. And a lot of people would look at that today and say, oh, well, maybe you were meant to be a boy. No, I just liked sports.
Yeah.
Right. You know, those cultural barriers don't signify our gender, right? Our bodies signify our gender. But with this diagnosis being increased, what's happening, at least what I'm experiencing and seeing, is amongst that age of middle school girls specifically, there's a massive increase in this gender dysphoria, because you have young girls who Sometimes are on the spectrum, sometimes have learning disabilities or on the fringe,
Mm-hmm.
and they are being preyed upon. So they end up on social media and they're having trouble making friends, and they end up, there's this whole culture of people pushing agendas, and preying upon the vulnerable and trying to convince them that maybe they're the wrong gender, and so
Mm-hmm.
these young women are looking at themselves and saying, I don't have many friends, I have a tough time fitting in. What's wrong
Yeah.
with me? Oh, well, it must be this. And it's happening in clusters, really interestingly. So, you know, prior to this, you'd see a lot of these individuals cutting, unfortunately,
Mm.
or calling themselves gay or part of the LGBTQ club. And now it's brought to the extreme of, well, I'm in the wrong gender and I need to be called something else.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, it's just this kind of sad confusion and reality going on in our culture. I mean, it's beyond just those middle school girls, right?
Yeah.
We see a lot of things, whether that's at a young age, giving children hormone blockers, which is extremely harmful, or just this week something came out. I think it was Vanderbilt University. They were pushing. Um, you can't change a sex like you're born sex, but sex change surgery. And they're quoted, they're recorded saying it's for financial reasons because they make a lot of money off of it. So
Oh, wow.
yeah, I mean, we're in a pretty confusing time, and I think what's happening, I mean, I'm just pointing out all the negatives, but I think what's happening is a lot of people are looking around and saying, how do we even approach this, right?
Yeah.
Because if we take any type of stance, we're labeled as haters or as unaccepting. And this is contra what the church believes about God creating us male and female in his image and likeness.
Mm-hmm.
And so the forum, it has just a host of incredible experts. I'm humbled to be among them, of people in different fields, whether it's kind of working on the public policy side, whether it's a parent of somebody who's gone through this. We have I think a psychiatrist, a woman who's going to share her own story, a lawyer. I'm just there to, I don't know, talk about the theological basis of why we believe what we believe, similar to what we've already talked about. So it's a really full day, and I think it's going to hit a lot of different angles,
Yeah.
so that when you have, one, to increase awareness of what's actually going on, but two, how to respond. So whether you're a parent or a nurse or a teacher or a lawyer, we're just curious and seeing it, right? A concerned
Yeah.
citizen. We're going to talk about, as a church, how are we called to respond?
Yeah, and the key piece too is like a loving response or a loving approach to it that doesn't degrade the individual that might be going through it, right? That's
Mhm.
the challenge. And Father Mike Schmitz had a video out recently that said like the main things people think of when you just stop people on the street and ask them, what do you think about Catholicism? And most people, like, what comes to mind first? And he was like, hate, bigotry, racist, like all these bad things. And it's like, well, what do we do with that? Right?
Mhm.
Because if we even question or if we even try to approach this topic in a confused world, then we might be labeled as some of those things. And maybe
Mhm.
that's why that's what's associated with the Catholic name, right?
Mhm.
Or the Catholic Church. And I like this forum because it speaks not from emotion. It speaks in a very like intellectual, objective way that from different experiences that allows people to be invited into the discussion. And that's really what I think the benefit of it is. It's like it's starting a discussion in this local area. And whoever watches it, I think it's going to be live streamed.
Mhm.
It starts a discussion to say, hey, how do we approach this in a way that is preserving the dignity of everybody
Mhm.
involved? Whether it be the parent, the child, the community, society. So that's what I like about it. And I'm excited to see what the speakers say from their perspectives, and especially from like a psychiatrist's perspective, like what are they seeing now? Because I'm
Mhm.
sure when people are dealing with this stuff, that industry probably is flooded with people maybe talking to their psychiatrist or therapist about that. So it'd be interesting to see what that's about.
Yeah, I was on with the speakers the other day, and they're going to talk about some study done, but those that are having gender dysphoria and have sought therapy. Now, I'm not talking about good, wholesome Catholic therapy. I'm talking about therapy in general. End up worse off than those that kind of go through that stage and let it kind of ride itself out. Because I think within therapists today, there's a lot of affirmation, like, oh, this is how you are, rather than, okay, well, why are you experiencing these emotions, right? The why behind is so important.
Like helping them understand what they could be.
Oh, and what's the trigger, right?
Yeah.
What's the wound? What's the source? And then not accepting, right? I mean, you mentioned love, and love is willing the good of the other. It's like in today's society, people don't need to be tolerated. They don't need to be like, oh, that's good for you. They need to be loved, right? Because when you look at all of the harmful effects, the staggering suicide rate of individuals who have undergone, any type of, again, sex change. You can't change your sex, but surgery.
Yeah.
The suicide rate is astronomical. And so it's actually harmful. Or when you look at putting a child on hormone blockers, what that does to them on a physical level, but also it inhibits their mental growth.
Yeah.
It inhibits their sexual growth, their mental growth, their emotional growth. And so you end up, their physical growth, so you end up with individuals who aren't as developed. And so, again, I think they're going to do a great job of presenting this is the reality, because we don't see that anywhere else.
Yeah.
But they're seeing it in their professions. I'm seeing it with young women that I work with. But again, how do we have these conversations? How do we help these individuals? How do we refer them to the proper people so that they don't end up harming themselves, really?
Yeah, and my question too would be like, what's the pastoral approach to this? Like, how do we shepherd and walk with people in this, And you kind of do that with your program, I think, a little bit, with the women that come on those retreats and engage with you. And what would be your take on the pastoral approach?
Sure, and actually I didn't mention him before, but we are gonna have a priest at the forum as well.
Oh, awesome!
So he works with Courage and Encourage, which is a church organization that works with individuals struggling with same-sex attraction. But I also think they've expanded it to gender dysphoria.
Okay.
And he was on this call the other day, and he, that's kind of going to be his take, because not only is this affecting the individual, but it's affecting their families pretty deeply, and just the division that happens in families, and so I think he's going to speak into that. But from my perspective, again, if I come at somebody I don't know and I just say what you're doing is wrong, well, that's so easy. That's where this flippant, well, you're just a hater can happen. We have to have the courage to enter into people's stories, to get to know them, to acknowledge them, to acknowledge their significance, to acknowledge their dignity, but then also to acknowledge their struggle, and to in curiosity ask some of those hard questions, right? I think we fear, and this is whatever somebody's dealing with that I work with, we fear sometimes asking the hard question.
Yeah. But
you find that these individuals, when it's in love, when they know you care for them, when you've built that relationship, even if it was like, hey, my parent wants, some parent wants me to talk to their kid, building that relationship over time, and then in love, asking them some poignant questions like, are you happy? Or why do you feel this way? Or, are you satisfied, right? What do you desire? What do you think the purpose of life is? Is this going to fulfill you? Some of those like deeper questions, it's just human questions. Yeah. Really begins to allow them to think, rather than just like, oh, this is you, good for you. Yeah. Because I think at the end of the day, a lot of these things are cries for help. Yeah. Right. They are. And so we have to have the eyes to see beyond what somebody's just putting up as a front. And ask the question like, well, what are they actually saying? What are they actually asking for? What do they actually need? I think that's just with whoever you're talking to, it's always just a really good question to ask. Yeah. And I was going to say, that's a good advice for anybody's mess. Like, we're all broken. We're all have mess in our life, regardless of what the issue is. And that's one thing I like too, is like when I was kind of struggling with faith back in like early high school and things in middle school,
one of the things I always thought was like, oh, the church is for perfect people, and I'm not going to ever live up to that, right? So why would I ever be part of the church?
Right.
But the reality is we're all broken. We're all not perfect. The church is full of sinners. And I like to approach people in the sense that I'm no better than you. Like, just because you're dealing with this, I'm dealing with something different, but doesn't mean that I'm better than you because of that, right? And so I like what you said about entering their life and like walking with them on that journey, because understanding their story is a huge part of like building trust, building that, and showing that you love them in a genuine way. And so I really like what you said there, because I think that's the answer to the pastoral approach, is like, they're not, when I use the word they, it's like, they're not external from the church. They are part of the church. Like whatever they're going through, they're still part of the church, and they're in need. Everyone, like myself included, we're in need of guidance always. And that's why we have reconciliation. That's why we do that, right? That's why we go to adoration. That's why we go to celebrate the Eucharist at Mass, because we're broken, you know? So I like that. That was a good answer.
Thanks.
Yeah, so it sounds like the Clarity in a Confused World Forum is going to be awesome, with a stacked panel of speakers. And thank you for your work on Fierce. I mean, the stuff that you're doing is just amazing. And this is your full-time focus, right? Fierce? That's amazing. You do this every day.
Every day.
Wow.
It's a gift. It's a gift. You know, and how the two are colliding right now, I'll just point this out real quick, is, you know, at this point, we have male athletes competing against women. And that is something, as a female athlete who's worked her whole life to, you know, get to where I've gotten, that's something that infuriates me. But at the same time, the Lord's worked in my heart to really soften my heart for just the brokenness of these individuals. But I'm not gonna roll over and say, yeah, you come play my sport. I'm gonna fight, and I'm gonna explain to them, you know, how that's making me feel, and a lot of women feel. So, you know, I've seen the wave coming for a couple years, but when I started Fierce, I didn't think that, you know, these two worlds would be colliding as directly as they are. But my prayer is that the more I can empower women to be strong and feminine, and be lights, that is going to change this culture. And I do hope that sport is a natural end to some of the transgender stuff, because it's causing people to wake up and say, oh my gosh, there are biological differences between men and women, and this is unfair to women. So we're heading in a little bit of the right direction, but we'll see how things continue.
Yeah, and I'm so glad we're able to have this conversation, because that's really what this podcast is about, to be real and authentic when we're talking about stuff. And also, I think that message translates well to any discussion when it talks about men and women competing against each other in sport or any issue. I think it's good to sit down and have a conversation to see different perspectives. And I'm glad you shared yours today on this show. And any last message for the audience that, you know, whether they're interested in Fierce or, you know, dealing with some of these challenges in the culture, of the tsunami of the culture, any last message for them?
Yeah, I mean, it's simple. Be you. Now, who God wants you to be you. Like, our culture says be you and be whatever you want to be, but be you is who God has created you to be within the moral context of what he's laid out. But when we're authentically ourselves, when I'm just authentically Samantha Kelley, daughter of God, the gifts that I've been given is how I'm going to love the world. Yeah. And so in an age of conformity, I just encourage people to really go to the Lord and ask him how he sees you and how he wants you to serve. And if you want to learn more about Fierce, fierceathlete.org is the place to look. We have a podcast as well.
Oh, there we go.
Resources.
Maybe we'll link that. Yeah, we'll link that in the description.
Resources, all the clinics and the retreats and the speaking we offer. I also, there's information on there about one-on-one mentorship, and we got a lot coming down the pipeline. So check out fierceathlete.org. Great.
Well, with that said, thank you, Samantha, for coming onto the show. And actually, if you notice, we have new mics. If you're watching us on YouTube, we have new mics thanks to William Bellitta, who raised money for a lot of the media stuff in here. So Big shout out to him. Thank you for that.
Thank you.
And also, if you guys want to come onto the show email media@stpeterchurch.net. That is media@stpeterchurch.net. We'll schedule time to talk about what you can talk about, and then we can schedule a show, just like Samantha here. So thanks again for coming on. We'll see you next time.